Welcome to the Human Frame podcast with me, Łucja Hawking. Today I'm joined by Mita. Arya Danaparamita. Mita is a queer migrant activist, writer and organiser engaged in decolonial justice, a critical storyteller with international journalism and human rights experience. They work with communities at the intersections of art, archive and abolition. Born in Indonesia and currently living in the UK, they received their BA from Wesleyan University in America and a master's from SOAS University in London. Thank you so much for joining me today, Mita, when I'm really excited for this conversation, actually.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm also very excited to have this conversation with you.
And I'm just going to jump straight into the first question. Can you share a bit more about your journey to the UK and how you basically got where you are?
It's been a long and meandering journey, I think, in terms of physically coming to the UK. As you mentioned, I was born in Indonesia, but I've been fortunate to through scholarships and other opportunities, live in other parts of the world. So I've lived in the US, in a little bit in France, in Cambodia as well. I decided to first move to the UK, again on scholarship to do my master's at SOAS. And that was informed by my academic and personal interests at the time, because I was interested in exploring colonial histories and specifically knowledge production during the colonial period and how that impacts relationships in visual, cultural, material culture production today. It felt important for me to come to the UK as the centre of empire, and so that's kind of what initially drew me to London, specifically also because that's where all the archives are, because part of that colonial relationship, as I'm sure you know, is the fact that a lot of our knowledge and source materials have been taken away and are now held in these colonial repositories in the heart of empire. So I needed to come to London to access them. So that was the original reason why I chose the UK. So that was actually back in 2016. So that was also an interesting time to come to the UK because it was at the height
when Brexit happened.
Yeah. Exactly. So it felt like a lot. I was learning a lot about the country. I think the country was learning a lot about itself. And so it was interesting to combine the sort of what was initially just sort of an academic interest with the real life kind of materialization of these colonial relationships in terms of how the UK was now shifting its relationship to migration, how that was affecting the conversations around Brexit, and how that then materialized into policies, particularly at the time in relation to EU citizens, right? But also broadly attitudes towards migrants and refugees in general. Through that, being in London at that particular time, it was also an exciting time to be in London, I think, because whenever we see these sort of attacks or threats to rights or communities, what we also see is the really encouraging show of solidarity, right? And people coming together to actually say, we don't agree with all this attacks on our communities and we stand in solidarity. So it was through that period that I also began to get involved in migrant justice organizing and border abolition organizing.
How did that experience then shape your perspective on Asylum and the work that you've done with JCWI and Liberty and all the really great organizations that you've worked for?
Yeah, so I think initially and currently still, I would say my primary engagement with migrant justice has been through the grassroots organizing. So while I was at SOAS, I got involved with what was then SOAS Detainee Support. It's now been rebranded to Solidarity Detainee Support, or SDS. So they provide visiting support, so emotional as well as practical solidarity to people held in immigration detention and prison, particularly those facing deportations. And although I was then, ironically, partly because of Brexit and the environment at the time, where a lot of employers were very cautious about hiring anyone who's not a UK citizen, I actually wasn't able to find a visa sponsorship, so I had to leave for the UK and then come back in the middle of COVID, actually. I'm still not sure why I did that, but and so it was
I was
also
in Australia when COVID broke out and I had to fly back. So I feel everyone was in different places where it was just the world just came crashing down.
yeah, and it was kind of like, oh, now is the chance to like get in before the borders close up again. And anyway, so it was interesting to come back, I guess, several years on and to see how the situation, the landscape shifted. Unfortunately, then and now, I feel like both in terms of the policies that are in place, but also the narrative and rhetoric that's going around, things have only worsened, I think, for migrants and refugees. So particularly around detention and deportations. The detention estate is expanding. So the current Labour government is seeking to reopen two formerly closed detention centres. It was also, back with the previous government, we saw the complete farce and thankfully now defeated Rwanda plan. But, that was quite an acute, I think, attempt at, I suppose, cruelty.
With a complete waste of taxpayer money as well, which a lot of people I don't think realize how much was spent with no one even going. And now, even looking at I mean, I don't know if it's on your, but it's definitely on my mind, is the 1-for-1 scheme with France, which I just don't see the point of it anyway. But we can talk about that more later down.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I suppose I'm back in the UK. I'm bringing in a lot of the, past experiences that I've had in the UK previously, but also in that interim period when I was back in Indonesia, it was also a time for me of quite active, again, grassroots organizing, resisting a lot of anti-democratic and authoritarian steps by the government, doing a lot of protesting and a lot of organizing on the ground, which unfortunately does become quite relevant now, that I'm back in the UK, where we are seeing some of the same sort of, I would say, anti-democratic and authoritarian measures being put in place. So there's heightened attacks on migrants and refugees, as well as individuals, lawyers, and organizations supporting migrants and refugees, and general defense of human rights in general. And as well as like now, particularly with this current government, the clamping down on protest rights and dissent and just our voice as civil society in general. So I suppose all of this in many ways has actually strengthened my resolve, I think, in terms of seeing the activism, the policy influencing, the grassroots organizing, but also, using other means of communicating and campaigning, such as the arts and film and photography and other kinds of arts and culture, to try to push back against this narrative and actually build the world that we actually want to see, where we take care of each other.
Exactly. And I think that's also, I mean, I've said this a lot, but I think film and documentaries and that can sometimes shape people's perspectives a lot more than all the campaigning that we do sometimes. So I just wanted to get a sense of what really motivated you to speak out about, asylum and detention and deportation through filmmaking.
Yeah, I think part of it is quite personal, right? Because a lot of these policies and rhetoric is affecting me as well. I am a migrant to this country, and as well as like seeing it affect other members of my community. I'm quite fortunate to not be here as a refugee, although I did come under like quite difficult circumstances as well. But specifically seeing the level of like cruelty and hostility directed particularly at people who are fleeing war, fleeing persecution, victims of torture, trafficking. It's just, for me, it becomes, like a moral urgency to kind of respond to that in any way that I can. And so the way that I can is, the sort of on the professional side with policy influencing, but also because I am passionate about photography and film. Like that was where I felt like, okay, how can I use my skills in other ways as well to kind of push back against the narrative and reframe the narrative and actually put forward just more caring and compassionate conversations around migration. I hadn't shared this before, but part of my very kind of eclectic, I think, journey in life has also included journalism. And so that was actually my first job coming out of university. And that's where I began exploring photojournalism and documentary as a form of communication and effective means to push for change. So after several years in the sort of more traditional advocacy kind of methods, I kind of felt like, again, both in terms of a strategic consideration of thinking, okay, what other tactics can we use, but also, again, bringing in my personal experience, I suppose there was a calling to return to creative practice as well. Yes, and as you say, I do think that particularly in light of the current media and just narrative environment, a lot of the narratives that are being said about refugees and migrants are quite like visual and visceral, actually, right? Like there's certain parts of the media and politicians who are, essentially using the situation to manufacture fear against this sort of like completely made up threat or like invasion of people coming to the UK. And so, as well as other attempts at actually demonizing these, people who come to the UK as like criminals or like inherent, as if somehow they are inherently more violent or prone to criminal behavior and things like that, which is obviously we know is incorrect. So, yeah, I think for me, finding ways to counter that in equally more visual and visceral ways felt important because I wanted to get past the sort of politicized talking points and really get to how people are actually feeling about the situation and meeting people where they are and creating that conversation.
Yeah, and it's also interesting. I don't know, a while ago, I saw something on social media and it just made me think really interesting about this because obviously, like within the early 2000s, 2010s, it was all about, Eastern Europeans coming, taking away our jobs. And like, as an Eastern European myself, that whose parents came here to get a job, it's quite an interesting rhetoric because now it's shifted, as you said, to refugees and asylum seekers, being migrants that are getting demonized in that sense. So it's just interesting to see who is getting to blamed because that kind of set of migration has become more embedded within community, but there still needs to be a kind of scapegoat. There is no other way to kind of say it than that. And it's kind of being shown throughout different European countries and in America and in Australia as well, at most globally, really. So it's really interesting to illustrate that and really, I don't know what your thoughts about like smashing myth busting is, because I think there's a really big divide in the sector of whether to myth bust or whether not to. I don't know what you think about that because I'm very torn sometimes.
Yeah, I know. It's really difficult. Like, I think it's also important to acknowledge that the level of like power and resources and the imbalance that we have in terms of, a lot of the right-wing press and politicians who are making that arguments are also backed by literally millionaires and billionaires. Meanwhile, here we are in our like little communities and organizations trying to counter all of that with effectively no resources. So in some ways, on that conversation around myth busting, we're also, I think it's important to acknowledge the amount of misinformation and misleading content that is out there. First of all, to just know what we're up against. And so in light of that, I'm always, maybe this is the sort of journalistic side of me, I do think that whenever there is misinformation, it is important to correct it. But also, I do think that we are now living in an era where digital information is just circulating in such a way that it is genuinely not possible to correct every misinformation out there or to bust every myth that's out there. So personally, I do lean more towards, what are the narratives that we want to tell? And that is where I personally am putting my energy into, instead of kind of constantly reacting to, but rather like what can we proactively present as the alternative. And then I think another area that I'm really interested in is, and that's been my approach with the recent film that I made, is again more exploring what people's positions are on the issue and how they feel about it, rather than trying to kind of provide a prescriptive or, yeah, I suppose authoritative like version even of what the our alternative world should be. It's really just getting people to reflect on, well, what do you want the world to be and how would you like to feel in it?
And when you spoke about your film, so it was Dover 82 that you made, and honestly, it's really, I've watched it a few times now with like screening it at different places, and it was just the first time I watched it, it was just so impactfully, but not in a way that film normally, like I've not seen a documentary be used in that way before, because there is no sound. It's just, the waves and the coastline of Dover, right? Which is what people coming across see. So I'm just curious to hear what your kind of line of thinking of doing that, and whether you intended to have that kind of impact of just the silence and taking in the what seems to be like a quite beautiful landscape, but then has this, negative impact from how migration and asylum is portrayed.
Yeah, so I think the film is really important to me. Firstly, because it's the first film I've made as a writer and director. It's a short little film, so I'm not like trying to overhype it or anything. But
Still incredible and impactful. So
I'm glad that it has, yeah, that it does. I mean, that is always, I think, for me, the purpose is trying to connect to people and evoke some kind of like emotional response, whatever that may be. And I do see the film itself as more of a like a question or an offering or a proposition that people can then, process and react to in their own ways. And it is a much more experimental film. It's not a typical documentary where you about migration or about channel crossings where you interview people or even talk or provide information about what's going on. It's a very stripped back approach to it where I am just showing, yeah, as you mentioned, landscape and different architecture of border infrastructure in Dover. And I think my goal with that is to move past, as I mentioned, that highly politicized kind of rhetoric and imagery of channel crossings, people on small boats. And I wanted to get people to reshift how they're relating to the issue by bringing it back to, I suppose I wanted, the camera is positioned from the perspective of someone who's on the UK side of the border looking out. So for me, it was about inviting people to think about, well, what's your relationship to Dover specifically, but to the Dover as a border in particular. Yeah, as you say, kind of showing the contradictions that exist within one place and how we all experience it differently depending on our positionality and where we're coming from. I think Dover represents so much to so many different people for various reasons. So it's both a site of, yeah, people go there to travel, people go there on holidays. Maybe I actually don't know if people go
Oh
to.
no, I have. I
Oh,
mean,
okay,
when
yeah.
I came over to the UK, we came through the ferry on my
Right.
dad's van. So that perspective for me, it's quite interesting. I literally came to this country as a migrant on a van on a ferry, whilst
Mm,
people on small boats who, I had the privilege because Poland became part of the EU, right? And Tony Blair opened the borders. But then I look at, what the other perspectives are and how unfair that is, whilst we
hmm.
came as economic migrants, right? Whilst people who are fleeing wars and persecution get a completely different experience. And the calm peaceful sights of Dover that your film portrays is met with brutality and border guards and being taken and basically taken to detention centers, and the brutality that it comes whether you're a child, a woman, a man, or whatever. So I think, again, just portraying those different perspectives and making people think of, well, what does Dover mean to you?
Hmm.
It's just such an interesting perspective that I just don't think many people have really thought about, or have, but haven't really analysed it in the way that your film kind of just strips back and makes you think about it even more.
Yeah, and I think there is something that I also wanted to explore too, is that, you definitely mentioned the violence that people do encounter. The film itself was I was felt compelled to make the film because at the end of 2024, it was the deadliest year on record so far for channel crossings, and that's the name of the film. 82 is honoring the number of people who died. So it's very much coming out of that sense of grief and loss, and as well as anger and rage. But I also wanted to kind of show the quiet violence that happens, right? So much of the what we call border violence is bureaucratic, and it can come across, it's not just the sort of overt violence directed at someone, but it's also the ways that we neglect people's needs, we neglect people's mental, physical, emotional needs when they come here, particularly when they are fleeing such traumatic situations, and then, yeah, removing them out of our communities and warehousing them in isolation where they aren't able to access legal advice or support. And so yeah, it's all of that as well that I try to explore. What was interesting actually is when I at one of the screenings of the film in Birmingham, I believe, one of the comments coming from the audience was that they found it surprising how quiet Dover was, because from all the media reporting that this person had, been exposed to, they genuinely thought that it would be hordes and hordes of people, like thousands coming through every day. And actually, that just isn't the case, right? Like, I know that there's these sensationalist front pages about the numbers of people crossing on channel crossings, but that's such a, I know this isn't really the point, but that's such a small proportion of the people who do come in and out of the UK every day
It's,
on
isn't it?
planes.
I think from the numbers or statistics that I've heard recently is that it's 1%, right, of
Yeah,
people who live on
exactly.
small boats. And it's the, like you said, the media churning it out and all this far right hate coming towards people and migrants coming here illegally when, you know, it's really not true. And like again, with the myth busting stuff, it's really interesting what newspapers also pick up and
Mm-hmm.
how that then carries to, I mean, far right protests and demonstrations that we had, like even most recently on, I think it was a couple of Saturdays ago.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what your opinions or thoughts on that is, or how to kind of counter stuff like that as well.
Yeah, that is a big
It's a
question. And
massive question.
it's quite an existential question, right? Because in many ways it is about, as I kind of, yeah, it's about what kind of society do we live in that we want to live in. And I think yeah, I don't know how you've been feeling about the rise in sort of hate and hostility
I
and
think for me, I remember, so I obviously I live in London, but I came
mm,
out my house and I just walk into the tube and it's like a 20-minute walk. And I saw the UK flags, like
hmm
English flags, everywhere. And this was
mm,
before anyone said anything about it. And I just looked at it and I thought, this feels really odd. Because it was on
mm,
like roundabouts, it was on random like roads and bridges that have nothing like that in mind. And then everyone started talking about it in sector meetings I was having, and then the far like all the protests were happening. So it just made me think like, who do we live around? And why are people
mm.
having these kind of, you know, really extreme views when, I mean, I find it really interesting how a flag can portray so much. I don't know, I don't want to say patriotism because I don't think that's what it is. I think it's
mm.
being used as a way to put, in this instance, British values, right? But whatever country you're in is that kind of instinct. But it just made me think of, do people actually know exactly what it is, and do they know why they're putting that down? I
Mm.
don't know if that makes sense. I don't know how you felt as well.
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to the sort of strength in symbolism. And I think that's always been, going back to our earlier conversation, I suppose, like that's always been an interest of mine, is how like visual language is being used to communicate and control power. And yeah, I think it's been really, really hard, I think, just watching it all happen. And I'm grateful that I personally haven't been subjected to any, like threats or abuse or attacks or anything, but, have had friends who have been subject to like, been shouted at or had like water thrown at them while they're walking down the street. Like it's actually been um quite distressing, I think. And I think it's important to acknowledge that and like say that that's where we're at. Yeah, I think it was interesting because I went to a talk recently where it was someone who was active during the rise of fascism in the 70s. And I found that quite helpful in the sense of reminding me that unfortunately this isn't new, and like we have been here before and we have survived this before and we always come out stronger at the other end. You know what I mean? So there
Yeah.
is a part of me that's trying to moderate these feelings of like anxiety with knowing that there's so many more of us who don't believe in the hate.
Yeah, but I guess it's also there's a lot of racism around it as well. And one specific thing that comes to mind is I remember my friend who did my human rights masters with me was on the tube, and she doesn't look like a migrant herself, although she is. I mean, I don't also because, I'm white. But it's interesting how people assume what nationality and where you're from, how you identify, whether you are a migrant and whether you're not. But anyway, she was on the tube and she saw a man looking quite suspiciously, looking at people a bit weirdly. This man was counting, and she was like, she was thinking, oh no, I know this is exactly where this is going. And he starts going, half of you aren't English here, just because obviously half the people there
Really?
weren't white. They were obviously obviously they were Brit. A lot of them probably identified as British because being British is a lot of different things. And it was just absolutely crazy about how race is used in such a way, and how just because someone might not look stereotypically English or British or whatever you want to call yourself is it's just disgusting, and then portraying that far right rhetoric in it
Mhm.
when you know maybe someone that doesn't look typically foreign is actually foreign, and someone who does is actually fully British. And who are
Mm.
you to tell someone whether they are or not and how they identify?
And why
Yeah,
does it matter, right? Even if someone isn't
exactly.
British, right?
Exactly. And also in London, of all places, like London's the most
Mm.
multicultural place in well, actually, I don't know, maybe I think up north is probably also very multicultural. So
Hmm.
there's that divide of the racist rhetoric also being used, and not only a migration one. So I don't really know
Mm.
what question with that, but I don't know if you have any points to share on that side as well.
Yeah, no, thank you for voicing that because yeah, I think yeah, migration has become so racialized and it's interesting as you mentioned before, like the way that the target groups have evolved over the years, right? Where before Eastern Europeans were not seen as part of the sort of white protected class, and now there's potentially in light of the war happening in Ukraine and how the UK was responding to that in by immediately welcoming all the refugees from Ukraine. So it's interesting to see like how whiteness in that category has always like evolved and expanded or retracted depending on who people want to attack. So yeah, I think it just goes to show that like race itself is like such a malleable construct that is very liable to being manipulated and weaponized against different communities at different times in history. And I think, yeah, I mean, I feel like we all know this anyway, but it's important to voice that like the UK has always been, in my view, a racist state. It's, starting from its imperial history, certainly. But it's also interesting to see how Englishness in particular has developed as like an identity, and again how that category has evolved over time. For example, the way that it historically has been used to oppress the Welsh, the Scots, the Irish as well, who were seen as outside of that category, and now they're kind of okay, but you can see moments where like the fractures are actually still there, and how quickly that those fractures can be activated, I guess, and turn into hate and
Yeah,
violence.
exactly. And it's not like to say that, like I don't want to be the one saying, everyone in the UK is racist, because that's absolutely not true. But it's
Mm,
just like, the way systems are put in place. I think it's also a lot
hmm
of systemic racism that
hmm
like for example the NHS, obviously there is ways where it reflects within society, so there needs to be a more systemic change, and the only way I guess that that can happen is if individuals speak out about
Mm,
it a bit more. You know, if
hmm.
you obviously don't agree with it, then don't say, and like stay silent when you see it happening. And
Yeah.
that's a really great way of slowly building societal change, which is obviously a lot harder to do than anything else in.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think that's what I mean when I say like the UK is a racist state. I do mean that in terms of the infrastructures of the state and the systems in place. But yeah, I think it's hard because I also understand that people will have different, I suppose, like risk assessment in terms of do they feel safe intervening? Do they feel safe saying something? What happens if the context is, quite a vulnerable one where perhaps it's a family member or someone in a position of like quite a lot of power, like your boss in the office or something like that. So, I'm trying to hold as much like empathy and grace as well in terms of how people respond. But you're absolutely right. I think the reason why it's gotten so bad is because over the years, so much of this rhetoric has become more and more normalized that people are more emboldened to express their racism in actual physical violent ways. It was interesting actually in that talk that I mentioned with the person with reflecting on the difference of the racism and fascism they saw in the 70s was they said that back then actually calling someone racist or a Nazi actually meant something and like people didn't want to be called racist or Nazis because I guess that history was a lot more recent, whereas now people are proud to call themselves racist or
Which is
neo-Nazis, and that's shocking.
shocking to me because
Yeah.
obviously, again, as a Pole myself, like
Mm,
I have family history with that, right? And it's that whole generational thing. No matter whatever, like I had family in camps, like so it's
hmm.
for me being that word Nazi holds so much like
Mm,
tension and anxiety, really. So it's just really interesting to me just how, people neo-Nazi stuff happen all the time. Or what maybe it's past the neo, but it's what the Nazi rhetoric kind of stood for and
mm,
is being reflected upon, which is absolutely shocking. But I guess the ideologies do align with the anti-migration, anti-otherness. I think that's the problem. And, people need to
mm,
see not otherness, but we're all human. And that's
hmm.
that's the thing that's being forgotten is what if you were in that position? I just want to go back a bit into the asylum and refugee system. What do you think are some of the most damaging gaps or failures in the UK's asylum system specifically?
Oh God. Yeah.
There's so many to
Where
pick from, so
exactly, where do we start? I mean, um, so I suppose my honest and I suppose potentially controversial answer as an abolitionist is for me, the failure starts at the point where we even categorize people as migrants and refugees. I believe that it shouldn't matter where you come from, where you were born, how you are able to live your life and thrive as part of our communities. Nation states are completely made up concepts and are very, very recent, actually, in terms of human history. Borders themselves, as lines on a map, are also very, very recent and is a direct result of colonialism. So for me, that on a sort of very basic level, I think categories around citizenship and who has access to rights based on that category, I think is fundamentally flawed. I think in terms of UK immigration system, I suppose like it might be helpful to kind of step back a little bit too. And like again, like I just sometimes I look back and like I'm surprised again at how recent all of this stuff is. The idea that we had citizenship and passports and passport controls at borders, like all of that is something that we invented in the last century. Like it never existed before then, and humans were fine. Well, there are other problems, I'm sure, but we managed to live without that. And then when borders became more essentially in the sort of sorry, I feel like now I'm going into lecture mode a little bit, but
no,
like
no,
in
it's great. This is exactly what I was interesting to hear that perspective as well. And like because some people don't think about it in that way.
Yeah, so I think in the 20th century, with the evolution of several things, decolonization that was happening, I suppose empires having to then confront, well, what happens when an empire collapses, and then people who were once kind of thought to be part of the empire are now their own kind of independent nation states with, God forbid, their own ideas of self-determination and their own needs and desires, how to manage that. And so then migration became to be seen as more and more of a security issue, and therefore borders started becoming hardened and seen as a security frontier rather than previously kind of primarily administrative, I suppose. So then we started seeing laws that enforce migration in a way that criminalizes certain acts. So, for example, the fact that now there's categories of legal and illegal immigration become more and more controlled for people who are not UK citizens. And this is the other thing that I find quite, again, shocking actually when I first learned about it is, the UK doesn't have birthright citizenship. So even if you were born here, it doesn't guarantee that you are a citizen of the country. And then on top of that, the way that the immigration system and who gets visas to come here, all of that is very much tied up in, colonialist and, quite frankly, racist ideas of who, or assumptions rather, of who deserves and doesn't deserve to be here, who is seen to be an addition rather versus a drain on so-called British society. So I do think that, the UK immigration system does then create these like hierarchies of who is deserving and not deserving. You've got, obviously it's changed a lot since Brexit, but you still have, EU citizens, for example, having relatively a lot more freedom and access to rights and resources. You've got so-called like UK global north allies like the US or Canada, for example, or like having specific pathways for people coming from Australia to come and work in the UK. And then you've got countries from former colonies in Asia or Africa where that is completely absent or severely restricted. So those aren't necessarily that I would say gaps in the system that's damaging. I think it's just the whole structure in itself is damaging, right? And then in terms of, I think refugees and asylum seekers in particular, oh God, I just got like a wave of just like
I know.
depressing thoughts. You know what I
I
mean?
was thinking there's a deportation stuff, then there's the detention stuff, then there's the safe route
Yeah.
stuff,
And just
and there's
like
the
just about for
citizenship stuff.
me. Yeah, and then for me, it's also just how much the things that we have taken for granted are completely not to be taken for granted anymore because they are actively being under attack or undermined by the government. So you know, calling back to that history of the Second World War and the Holocaust and the reason why the Refugee Convention existed in the first place and why it meant something was because, the whole world at the time like recognized the importance of protecting people who need to leave their homes to seek safety elsewhere, recognizing that this is a thing that happens throughout the world and that we all share a responsibility ultimately to make sure that we keep each other safe. And so to see the UK as well as the EU over time in the last decade in particular, like undermine the Refugee Convention has been just really, really discouraging. Yeah, I haven't got, yeah.
I think what puts it into perspective for me is also I don't know if you've seen Handmaid's Tale, and I know this sounds
Mm,
really far-fetched from what our conversation, well, not that much, but I think it's not forgetting that the Refugee Convention exists to protect everyone. Because
hmm
who knows, there might be a situation like in Handmaid's Tale when Americans were the refugees and had to
hmm
flee. So it's just
mm,
because we are privileged enough to not have to flee and stay in our homes and not feel like we're under threat or are persecuted or live in an area of war, it doesn't mean that, everyone's coming over here because, they all want to, I don't know, take advantage or whatever. It's really not. It's just everyone wants to
Yeah.
have the same rights that we have and have the privilege to have. It's the safety, making sure your family is okay, having food on the
Hmm.
table, having making an earning in order to support your family, not taking anything from it. So
Yeah.
that I think that for me puts it into perspective is the fact that, I mean, God forbid there was a war and everyone in the UK had to flee. The
Mm.
Refugee Convention would allow us to do that and give us those kind of protections. So, yeah, as
Yeah.
kind of putting it on the other foot, right? It's being like, well, imagine you were in those situations. What would you do to save your family? Everything.
Mm.
Because
Hmm.
people don't put their children on boats just for the sake of it because they want to. It's
Yeah.
dire measures when you know the risks involved.
Yeah, definitely. And, there are, of course, valid criticisms of the Refugee Convention. For example, the way that it kind of limits categories of persecution or like who, can qualify as a refugee. And, I think you're absolutely right. And I just want to add that it's not just situations of like war or like
Yeah,
mass scale destruction, right? It's also individual level persecution, for example.
exactly.
And we're
Yeah.
already seeing, actually, you mentioned the US. I was reading the other day that like people are already trying to claim asylum outside the US when they're trans because of the level of transphobia that's now present in the US. Yeah, that it qualifies as persecution of trans people in the US. We're not quite at that level yet in the UK, but I've spoken to other trans like friends and comrades who are considering whether the UK is still a safe country for them. And then there's, political persecution as well that happens. And, at the rate that like the authoritarian measures that we're seeing in the UK, that might become relevant to people who are now going to be seen as political dissidents or even terrorists, right? Given the everything that's been going on around that recently in terms of Palestine solidarity. So yeah, it's a lot that can affect people in the global north as well.
100%. And I was just going to
Yeah.
ask you, leading on to it, is how do you think, for example, gender and like can amplify difficulties within the asylum system as well? Because a lot of the time we've seen case through other charities and sectors and speaking to people is, it's the difficulty of having to prove that, you are persecuted or not as an individual, right? It might not be the whole country, but as an individual, you have to prove that you are gay or whatever you identify
Mm.
as. And yeah, how does that make more issues basically for claiming asylum as well?
Yeah, and that's the other, like, again, valid criticism, I think, right, of the asylum system is that it puts the burden on the individual to prove that they are being persecuted or that they are fleeing sufficient level of threat, right? And that does, as I'm sure you know, in terms of like what we see in frontline casework, it does mean that people have to disclose extremely personal and often very, very traumatic situations to their lawyers, to immigration officials, to the Home Office, etc. And then the kind of, I suppose, the dynamic that introduces, where suddenly the state is now the one deciding your identity and whether you're adequately suffering. That in itself is just, for me, quite a violent dynamic that is really, really difficult for people. I think on practical terms, it also leads to situations where people don't know to or don't feel safe to disclose some of this information. And so then their asylum claims get rejected. And so, yeah, it's really, really hard. And we just from previous work, for example, working with queer refugees and asylum seekers, a huge shared experience that they've expressed as well is the fact that some caseworkers and certainly Home Office officials are not equipped enough or trained enough to understand the realities of what it is to be, for example, gay or queer, and how persecution, as relates to the asylum context, can manifest differently. So, for example, someone may have to, is gay and in their previous country have had to be in a heterosexual relationship in order to protect themselves, and that's why they don't have the what you would think of as typical evidence to showcase their gay identity. And now that's, these survival mechanisms are now further weaponized against them in order to prevent them from accessing further safety. So yeah, it's just a really difficult and harmful system, really.
Yeah, and it's kind of very circular, you get
Mm.
trapped in this, well, I can't explain this because of this, and then it goes back again to the yeah, thanks so much. I think we've covered so much from, asylum to colonialism to the far right and yeah, everything in between. But just one final thing I wanted to ask you was looking ahead,
Mm.
what is your vision for a more humane UK asylum system, and what do you think is the role that storytelling could play in us getting there as well?
Mm. Again, quite a big question. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not
So,
I don't seem
especially
to
in
know
light of like the
everyone's.
conversation we just had, now my brain's just like, oh my God, what world do we live in? I have a lot of hope actually, and it's, Mariama Kaba says hope is a discipline. I think it's something that is a survival mechanism because unless we have hope, then it's like, what's the point of living? And it's the thing that for me orients our actions towards justice and a more just and caring world ahead. For me, find that hope and cultivate that hope in, I think, building relationships and finding community. And to me, that's ultimately where it starts. I think, as you were saying with the situation with the England flags, in the sort of level of like capitalism and neoliberal kind of world that we live in, we've become so isolated from each other. And on top of that, this sort of polarizing nature of the media and social media and internet discourse has, further isolated us from each other. So I think it is, I mean, it sounds really cheesy, but I do think fundamentally it comes from like building genuine human connection with each other. And to me, empathy and care is, and I've seen it, in real life where like so much of it starts from just like knowing someone who's been through a situation and understanding their situation. And that goes for both sides. Like it's understanding why someone might be coming to this country, fleeing violence and hardship, but it's also understanding why someone in rural Wales might feel what I would think is like misplaced rage and anger at that, right? Like where is that stemming from? So yeah, I think it has to come from building those connections and having those conversations at the community level. For me, I think the obviously on the professional side of my work, there's a lot of actual policy influencing and working within the institutions of the state, but fundamentally, as an abolitionist, I do think that our kind of liberation and collective wellness and well-being comes from what we create on the ground in spite of the state, right? So instead of just waiting and relying on the state to kind of change their policies, we can actually create these spaces of safety and care in our communities right now. So that's where I'm finding hope.
Thank you. It's been amazing to get your just thoughts on everything in your work and everything in between. So yeah, I just want to thank you again, and also maybe link your film to the description as well if anyone wanted to watch it as well, because like I said, it is very impactful, but from a different side that I've not seen a
Mm.
film do before.